Good afternoon, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the portion that is known as internal capsule of the brain. So, let us see that in the viscera and let us discuss and know the different parts of it and what is it. So, here in this specimen we can see here this one is one mid sagittal section of cerebral hemisphere, and here we can see this is the cerebral hemisphere of left side, because you can see this one is frontal pole and this is occipital pole, and here we can see the cerebellum, part of the cerebellum here, brainstem here, and this is the medial surface. So, we can say that this is the cerebral hemisphere of the left side. Okay. And you can see this one is corpus callosum, that is the largest commissural fibers. Okay. Now, we have already discussed about the different kinds of white fibers of brain. So, they are for recapitulation, they are projection fibers, commissural fibers and association fibers. So, for discussing internal capsule, we have to say something about the projection fibers. So, projection fibers are those fibers that goes from the cortical area to the subcortical areas or nuclei, and that forms a connection between the cortical neurons with the subcortical neurons and neurons of the brainstem and spinal cord further downwards. Now, this cortical projection fibers is coming from all aspect of the cerebral cortex, that is from the frontal lobe, from the parietal lobe, from the occipital lobe and from the temporal lobe, and those are some fibers are going away from the cortex towards the subcortical centers, and some fibers are running towards the cortex from the spinal cord, brainstem and other subcortical nuclei. So, there are two kinds of fibers, one are afferent fibers and another is efferent fiber. So, this cortical projection fibers forms a fan like expansion here, just like this, they are coming from just like this, and around the third ventricle and thalamus it forms, and this efferent and afferent fibers, those are going towards the cortex and those are coming from the cortex, forms a compact bundle of fibers that is known as internal capsule. So, seeing this viscera you can imagine that cortical fibers, nerve fibers are going like this, okay, from the cortical pyramidal neurons, and here just around the third ventricle and thalamus, you can see from this picture that this one is thalamus of the left side. So, around the third ventricle and thalamus, this all the fibers, projection fibers, those are also known as corona radiata, this forms one compact bundle of fibers, and that is known as internal capsule. So, let us see one transverse section here. We have seen this one is mid sagittal section and this one is transverse section or horizontal section. Okay. So, we can see in this picture that this is anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, this is on the right side, this is on the left side, and this is posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay. And these two, see minutely, these two greyish rather pinkish here you can see, these are two thalamus. Okay. This is right, this is left thalamus, and this space is for third ventricle. Okay. And this one, this is the partition between the two lateral ventricle, that is septum pellucidum. Okay. So, if you see minutely you can see that this is thalamus, this is head of the caudate nucleus, this part a bit greyish or pinkish, here in this side also this is head of the caudate nucleus, this is thalamus. So, there is some white fibers like this. Okay. Let us see more minutely. So, this is thalamus, this is head of the caudate nucleus, and this is lentiform nucleus, this one. Okay, this portion is lentiform nucleus. So, in between head of the caudate nucleus and thalamus, medially and laterally there is lentiform nucleus. So, these fibers, okay, this fiber is the fibers of internal capsule. Okay. Let us see in this side, in the right side. So, this is thalamus, this portion, this is head of the caudate nucleus, this area, and this one is lentiform nucleus. Okay. Medially there is globus pallidus and laterally there is putamen. So, this one is lentiform nucleus, this is head of the caudate nucleus, and this is thalamus. So, we can see these fibers, this is internal capsule of the right side. Okay. This is the compact bundle of fibers, that projection fibers, those are coming from the cortical pyramidal neurons. Okay. Those fibers, their intermingling is there between the afferent and efferent fibers, because the fibers which are going towards the cortex, that is present here, and also fibers going away from the cortex, that is also present in this compact white fiber area. Okay. Now, what is the shape of the internal capsule? It is roughly V shaped on horizontal section with the concavity directed laterally. So, you can see here in this side, see this is anterior limb, this one is posterior limb, and this is the genu of the internal capsule. So, you can see that roughly V shaped, okay, roughly V shaped, and its concavity directed laterally. So, this one is lateral side, concavity directed laterally. Now, this internal capsule is divided into 4 parts for the purpose of description. What are they? So, they are anterior limb, you can see here this side, this part is anterior limb. Okay. This is the head of the caudate nucleus, this is thalamus, this is lentiform nucleus. So, this part is anterior limb. Now, this part is genu, there is a bend here, this is anterior limb, this is genu, this is posterior limb, and the continuation of the posterior limb is retro-lentiform part. Okay. So, this is lentiform nucleus, retro means behind. So, continuation of the posterior limb extends as retro-lentiform part. Okay. So, these 4 parts are there, and there is another part, altogether 5 parts are there. Another part is sublentiform part, we cannot see here because it goes in the downward aspect. So, for purpose of description, we divide the internal capsule into 5 parts. One is anterior limb, see carefully, this is anterior limb. Now, this one is genu, okay. This part, this bent is genu, anterior limb, genu. Now, this area is posterior limb, okay, and this is the retro-lentiform part, same for this side also, and we cannot see here the sublentiform part. Now, let us discuss about the arrangement of different fibers. So, in the anterior limb, it intervenes between the head of the caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus. You can see here, this one is the head of the caudate nucleus and this one is lentiform nucleus. So, anterior limb intervenes between these two, and it through it traverse frontopontine fibers That means the cortical fibers coming from the frontal lobe and going towards the pontine nuclei. So, these fibers are being traversed by the anterior limb fibers goes to the nuclei pontis. The frontopontine fiber goes to the nuclei pontis of the pons and then towards the opposite neocerebellum, it cross in the midline. After it goes at the nuclei pontis. Then another fibers is fibers of anterior thalamic radiation. This also goes through this anterior limb of the internal capsule, and then both afferent and efferent projection fibers that connect the anterior thalamic nucleus with the gyrus cinguli. Okay. So, anterior thalamic radiation is connected with gyrus cinguli through some afferent and efferent fibers. So, what is gyrus cinguli? We can see from this. This one is callosal sulcus, and just above this is the gyrus cinguli. Okay. So, through this anterior limb, anterior thalamic radiation and gyrus cinguli is connected by efferent and afferent fibers. Now, medial forebrain bundle, these fibers also goes through this anterior limb from the orbital surface of the frontal lobe and through the hypothalamic nuclei. Then some of the corticostriate fibers, that means from cortex to the striatum, that is caudate nucleus, it also passes through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Now, what are the fibers goes through the genu? So, genu is an angulation between the anterior and posterior limb, already have shown you. So, the fibers are corticonuclear or corticobulbar fibers from the motor area of the brain, and those are connected with the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. Those are present in the brain stem and mostly of the opposite side. Okay. And corticoreticular fibers are also going through this part, genu. That means corticonuclear fiber and corticoreticular fibers are main content of this genu of the internal limb. Now, posterior limb. So, you can see here posterior limb, this portion is, this is posterior limb. Okay. So, through this posterior limb, this is longer than the anterior limb, and it lies between the thalamus medially and the lentiform nucleus laterally. So, this is lentiform nucleus. So, this is posterior limb. Lentiform nucleus, thalamus, this one is posterior limb. So, through this mainly the corticospinal tract arising from the motor areas of the brain, area 4 and 6, and also the corticorubral tract, that is from cortex to the red nucleus of the midbrain, and few corticostriate fiber, and again frontopontine, paritopontine fibers, those are going through this area. Corticospinal fibers are here somatotropically arranged. That means the fibers for supplying the upper limb is in the frontal aspect, in the anterior aspect of this posterior limb, and the fibers supplying the trunk in the middle aspect of the posterior limb, and the fibers supplying the lower limb in the posterior aspect of the posterior limb. That is a somatotopical arrangement. Now, again some fibers of superior thalamic radiation also goes through this posterior limb. Okay. And some nigrostriatal fiber and some fibers from the globus pallidus to thalamic nucleus. These are also going through this posterior limb. Now, sublentiform part we cannot see here, it extends below the lentiform nucleus and contains the following fibers. Just remember, through sublentiform part of the internal capsule, the auditory fibers of auditory radiation arise from the medial geniculate body. So, where medial geniculate body is present? Medial geniculate body is present in the posterior aspect of the thalamus. So, from this medial geniculate body, auditory radiation goes through and sweep forwards and laterally through the sublentiform part and project into the anterior transverse temporal gyrus and adjoining superior temporal gyrus, that is totally concerned with the hearing. Okay. and then fibers of Meyer's loop of optic radiation that also encroach that area. Okay. Now, retrolentiform part, we can see this retrolentiform part, this portion is retrolentiform, that is behind lentiform nucleus, this area retrolentiform part, it is a continuation of the posterior limb and it goes along the lateral wall of the posterior horn on the lateral ventricle. Posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, its lateral wall, it is related with the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule, and it contains the fibers of the optic radiation that arise from the lateral geniculate body, and it goes projects to the primary visual area, that is area 17 of the occipital lobe, and some corticofugal fibers, those arising from the areas 18 and 19, those are projected and it goes to the superior colliculus of the midbrain and some motor nuclei of the extraocular muscle for reflex oriented conjugate movements of the eyeball. The fibers of posterior thalamic radiation also goes through this retrolentiform part, and parietopontine and occipitopontine fibers are going through this. So, that is all for internal capsule. As all the cortical projection fibers are located in a compact bundle here. So, the arterial supply of the different parts of the internal capsule is very much important. If there is, and these are the arteries, these arteries are end artery rather, these are the central branches of the cerebral arteries and these are the end arteries. So, if there is any occlusion of the artery, so this part, the blood supply of this part will be affected, and that results in widespread affection of the body, that is paralysis or different other affection will be there. So, blood supply of these different parts of internal capsule is very much important. Okay. So, that is all for internal capsule. Thank you.